Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade in the year 775. As we now need to take a little bit of a step back in time. As last time we talked about Balhut and a blood-packed group hunting down a Sons of Sek traitor, and the ambitious plan that was spawned from the successful recapture and interrogation of said traitor. But we now need to investigate why a crazy, ambitious plan was necessary in the first place. After the Warmaster's long-awaited success against the fortress world of Moorland, and the subsequent reorganization of the Imperial Crusade, giving himself some 70% of the total military might of the Crusade, Warmaster Macaroth decided to drive onwards, as speedily and with as much force as he could conceivably muster, hoping to not give the enemy any opportunity to rally or ready another defensive line. This was pretty characteristic for Macaroth at that point, but many of his generals were really starting to get fed up with his headstrong attitude, particularly the commanders on the Corward Assault Front, or the Second Front, who were now expected to keep up with Macaroth's advances, meaning that they had to occupy the territory that he conquered whilst having access to far fewer military resources, and also fighting Anaquanar Sek at the same time. Once more, many of the commanders, gently disagreed with the Warmaster, and he, once more, told them to shut the hell up and follow him. Once more, Macaroth's strength did not lie in diplomacy, but his strategy proved successful yet again. With the breakage of the Moorland front, the Gaur's forces were clearly reeling, and Macaroth had no intention to let him gather himself again. For the next 4 years, he launched blistering attacks upon the Anarch's forces, driving them back before they could fully re-establish themselves anywhere, winning several relatively cheap victories. For a moment there, as the Crusade hammered into the Carcharodon cluster, it appeared as if Macaroth's bold gamble might finally have routed the Gaur completely, and might see the Chaos forces split asunder, with the Gaur's troops pushed back into the Sanguinary Worlds and Anaquanar Sek cut off from the Anarch. But in 779, Macaroth's plan began to collapse. The pace of offensive operations had been slackening for quite some time, as the Second Front was simply just not able to keep up with the Warmaster's increasing demands for their occupation of the worlds that he had taken over, forcing him to relegate more troops to hold the ground he had gained. Furthermore, the enemy's resistance was also growing stiffer, and the area in the Carcharodon cluster was growing unstable. Warp routes were shifting, transportations of troops were slowing, until eventually a major warp storm broke out in the region. For nearly a full 6 months, the Imperial Crusade was all but paralyzed, with only a single battle group under the command of Marshal Aldo able to move relatively freely, as it was free of the main warp storm interference. The Marshal swiftly decided to not continue the offensive because he would be horrifyingly outnumbered and crushed almost immediately. Thus, for half a year, the Crusade achieved nothing, whilst the Gaur fortified his position. There were a lot of suspicions around that time that the warp storm itself had been created by some arch-enemy mischief, but it is always difficult to tell with these things. As the Crusade was beginning to approach the Sanguinary Worlds part of the Badab Worlds, well, weird shit was growing even more frequent, and this might simply have been a freak warp storm. Regardless of its true nature, the fact remained that Macaroth's assault had been halted, and the enemy given time to fortify their positions. A fact that Macaroth soon realized, as whilst he had managed to cut through pretty much all of the Carcharodon cluster, he was now heading into the Erenis group, and was immediately halted upon its borders, with several lengthy and painful wars. Symbolic of this was the conflict fought on Anghisus Bone, which started in 781 and was not resolved until 783. The world was home to several hive structures, possessed in turn of truly vast and enormous subterranean areas. The hives having been built so tall as to sink hundreds of meters into the ground. Protected by the hive structures above as well, there was simply no way to level these structures from orbit, meaning that each and every one of them had to be taken by ground assault. The enemy delving deeper and deeper into the structures, laying traps and ambushes as they went, grinding through Imperial Guard regiments at a frightening pace. By the time the conflict could finally be brought to a successful conclusion, the Gaurite forces had largely rallied, and were now beginning to launch counterattacks against the Crusade forces, on worlds such as Tigris and Gilbertus. Macaroth now had to come face to face with the fact that his rapid assault intended to keep the Gaur off balance and deny him the opportunity to recover had failed, and that he now was going to have to yet again hammer his way through another moorland. And he really didn't have the forces necessary for this. Despite the coreward assault, the Second Front having already been stripped of the majority of their experienced regiments, and itself now struggling to keep up and maintain the war against Anaquanar Sec, there simply wasn't enough heft behind the Warmaster's swing against the Gaur's entrenched positions. He needed a lot more men, but he had nowhere to take them from. Any further weakening of the Second Front was likely to lead to a collapse. The Kulan system, upon which he had drawn so often in the past, had already suffered rebellions due to the large demands placed upon it by the Imperial Crusade. And the High Lords of Terra, once so supportive of the Crusade's efforts, they had grown well and truly tired of the slow progress. Desperate for some way to reinvigorate his forward momentum, the Warmaster elected to attempt the creation of a third front, sectioning off segments of his own forces and the coreward assault forces to create a third prong of attack. This was launched against Anaquanar Sec in 782, and met with some initial success under the command of Marshal Oldo. However, this initial success proved to have been a trap led by the Anarch. Having expected Warmaster Macaroth to try something bold and aggressive, as he had on almost all occasions done so far, the Anarch had allowed himself to appear vulnerable, pulling back his troops, ceding terrain and victories to the invading Crusade forces, only to slam shut around them like a bear trap, cutting off Marshal Oldo's troops, his Imperial Navy elements, and his Guard forces trapped on worlds long since surrounded by the Anarch, who then ground down the entire Third Front and completely obliterated it in 783. This was one of Macaroth's lowest ebbs in the entirety of the Crusade, and saw a rare moment of self-doubt come across Macaroth. The man who had always aggressively pushed forward in the face of any opposition, even from his own generals, now began to wonder if perhaps they had been right all along. He even considered breaking off the primary assault entirely, leaving behind garrison forces to hold the ground he had seized, and instead focus in on what his generals had claimed to be the lesser threat, Anaquanar Sec, to destroy him before turning with full force against the Gaur. However, for better or worse, a breakthrough then happened. Tigris, another world that had been contested now for several years, fell to the forces of Marshal Uriens, who, seeing an opportunity, immediately pushed onwards to the world of Kilgrave, reaching it in 784. This appeared to perhaps be a chink in the Gaur's armor, a promised second breakthrough, causing Macaroth to resolve not to cancel the offensive, and rather push the primary front onwards even harder. Though with the destruction of the tertiary front, he recognized that he wouldn't have any additional forces to call upon. He was running out of men as it was, and with the enormous war tithes he had already levied on the Sabbat worlds, it would take a very long time before substantial reinforcements could be created. And Macaroth was not at all sure that time was a resource he possessed. With the looming threat of the Gaur and Anaquanar Sec perhaps joining back up together and carrying out joint operations, the likes of which had once almost decapitated the Crusade, still looming, Macaroth needed and wanted to do something bold, something decisive, that even if it could not lead to the defeat of one of the two, could at the very least drive a thorough wedge in between them, to cut out any chance of such a cooperative agreement being reached. As he did correctly so surmise that with the rising power of Anaquanar Sec, friction was likely to have started between Sec and the Gaur, as Chaos warlords of comparable power tend to not play very well with one another. However, the fact also remained that it had been Sec who had actively submitted himself to the Gaur, specifically and assumedly to avoid a major break that might endanger the Chaos Force's position. It seemed extremely unlikely that Sec would make such a basic mistake as to attack the Gaur before he was ready, before he was absolutely assured that the Imperial Crusade could be defeated just with Sec's own forces, or that he knew that he could coup the Gaur's own troops to his side. That is, unless Sec believed that he was under assault first. Macaroth had no real idea of how such a thing might be carried out until an intriguing plan came across his desk, suggested by Lord Militant Sibon of the Corward Front. The report mentioned a certain Colonel Commissar that the Warmaster had taken a personal interest in, and even undercut at one previous point. It mentioned a Sons of Sec and previous Blood Pact turncoat that was willing to give up the position of several hyper-secret weapons laboratories and other areas of tremendous import to Anaquanar Sec, holdings that the Imperium shouldn't know about, and that Sec would not have any reason to believe that the Imperium would know about either. They were also all lying deep within Chaos-held territories, meaning that if somebody did suddenly arrive there with hostile intent, it was yet again unlikely for these to be Imperial forces. But now that the Imperium knew of their location, the plan had been made out, and Lord Militant Sibon took a great deal of credit for its creation and its pushing at Imperial High Command. 28 targets would be located and raided by Imperial forces, in essence on a one-way trip, as they couldn't send all that many men, nor that many ships. Yet they still needed sufficient martial might to overcome what was likely to be heavily defended facilities. This was the only reason why the Lord Militant didn't try his hand at this operation by himself. As Sibon himself said later on, if the operation had failed, it wouldn't really have been a significant failure to the Imperium. 28 minor raids was a pretty low-level expenditure, really. Yet if the operation succeeded, the operation might very well claim credit for unsticking the entire Crusade. Sibon would have loved to have been solely responsible for that. However, he needed Macaroth's approval because he needed his stamp on the paperwork. He needed, literally, his actual approval more so than his go-ahead. Because if Sibon could bring an operation backed by the Warmaster himself, along with him and other Lord Militants, he might just be able to marshal the kind of low-weight, high-effect military aid that such an operation required. Namely, of course, the Adeptus Astartes. It should, however, also be stressed that Sibon wasn't in this purely for his own self-aggrandizement. If it wasn't for his willingness to share credit, to extend the hand in cooperation with the Warmaster, whom he had vehemently disagreed with on many an occasion, and his willingness even to humiliate himself in front of the Space Marines to make Gaunt look better, well, without Sibon, the mission may very well have been doomed before it even began. And even with his aid, it was certainly a long shot. Not just because, well, they had to send 28 raids deep into enemy lines, but also due to the nature of the targets, as the majority of them were found within an area of space known as Salvation's Reach. A truly enormous mineral and asteroid minefield, filled with spinning rocks, with debris, with remnants of ships, remnants of asteroids, planets, and uncountable other things that frankly defied easy classification, to the point that the Imperium wasn't really entirely sure what Salvation Reach was even made up of, but there was a lot of rocks in there, and there are a lot of places to hide major enemy weapons programs, which was exactly what the primary target to be attacked by the Tarnith first and only was. A very large, hulking habitat that had originally been created and ran by Heritor Asphodel, the master of the previous Archon's weapons program. Under Nadzibar, the Heritor Asphodel had been working on all manners of fiendish things at this program, including traditional weapons of mass destruction and things of more esoteric and magical natures. Most of this information would be largely useless to the Imperium, really, or it would simply be too scared to try and use most of it. But denying it to the enemy was valuable enough in and of itself. Furthermore, the aim was, yet again, to sow discord between Anakwana Sek and the Archon Gaur. To do this, the 28 raids would be bringing with them clues to dump off in the area, pieces of blood-packed equipment, and more importantly, signals. The Imperium had painstakingly, with the help of Mabon, recreated blood-packed battle chatter, or at the very least something that sounded so close to it that none were particularly likely to understand the subtle differences or the nuances. At the very least, not an Aquinar sec. For all intents and purposes, after the Imperial raid had left their burning and destroyed target, it should, from signal intelligence's perspective at least, appear as if it had been raided by the Blood Pact. Assuming the installations could actually be destroyed in the first place, of course. These were massive installations, and again, due to secrecy, only a very small force could actually be dispatched. This is the part where the Space Marines come in, as no mere mortal force, no matter how elite or well trained, could pack the kind of power per pound ratio that the Adeptus Astartes could. Though some reinforcements of a more mortal nature would also be forthcoming. The Imperial Crusade had had a very hard time untangling its massive logistical nightmare of reinforcements over the last few years, with some companies and formations having been stuck in transit for years, bumping back and forth between fleets here, worlds there, reserve duty here, and the Tarnith, first and only, surprisingly, was not an exception to this, as it actually had had reinforcements en route for quite some time. Not Tarnith reinforcements, of course. That would have been unusual. No, Belladon and Verghast reinforcements. See, during the brief period of time when the Tarnith First and Only was joined with the Belladon and became the 81st First, the commander realized that meshing together such vastly different forces would be a challenge, and so he had sent a special request through the Munitorum and back to Belladon for very specific reinforcements. A single company of additional Belladon troopers, and this request had been granted. They were intended to have arrived long before the 81st First became Tarnith First and Only again, after the war on Anachronon Sextus, but again, due to logistical complications, this did not happen. Gaunt, of course, was overjoyed to be receiving new men, but perhaps not the kind he was expecting, as the Belladon reinforcements were a marching band. Complete with instruments and a cybernetic eagle mascot. Now, this made sense for the 81st First. A nice bunch of musicians, something for the regiment to take a bit of pride in, something to cheer on and unify around, right? Music, parties, livening up things and all that. But for the Tarnith First and Only, about to get sent on what was in all due likelihood a suicide mission, well, the drum and fife section was not quite as welcome. Fortunately, the Verghastites' reinforcements were quite different. 6 companies, led by a major by the name of Pasha Petrushevska. These fighting men and women would no doubt be quite welcome in the Tarnith First and Only. Slightly less welcome was Colonel Commissar Gaunt's son. Oh, alrighty then. See, Colonel Commissar Gaunt has a little bit of a James Bond-style thing to him, as he has attempted, with relatively high success rates, honestly, to sneak his way into the pants of most attractive females that have crossed his path. Indeed, he is even right now attempting to get in the pants of his regiment's soon-to-be chief surgeon, as the Tarnith's original surgeon, Dorden, had recently been diagnosed with severe cancer and was probably on his last leg. I don't know how wise it is to bang your sole remaining high-level qualified surgeon, but Details. Anyways, on the war on Verghast for Vervunhive, he had managed to infiltrate the panties of a highborn lady, who had now apparently produced a son, an heir. He had been dispatched to Colonel Commissar Gaunt's side, so that his dad's illustrious position as the people's hero would hopefully rub off a little bit on him, and for him to learn something from his father, the great war hero. Gaunt recognized this for what it was, a political maneuver. Association with the people's hero would be an invaluable asset to any member of Verghastite's upper society. To be able to draw upon a blood connection as well would be doubly so important. There were also other reasons, which we'll get into later, as I think we're going to have a talk about the final installment of the Ghost series, but we'll keep that separate for now. So, Meritus Felix Chas is Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt's son, and he's coming along for the suicide mission. Anywho, the Tarnith First and Only were adequately briefed of the task ahead of them. They were given opportunities to train and would be given further opportunities to do so on the journey towards their target in Salvation's Reach. They would also be given access to a specialized piece of equipment or two to effect their assault upon the hyper-secret weapons program. And they would be given a ship, the Highness Sir Armaduke. Once a very, very impressive warship that had fallen upon hard times. She had been severely damaged, damn near outright crippled, in fact, during the Kulan Wars, and had spent the last 27 years in a void dock, having repairs, extensive repairs, carried out on her. But the ship really was too far gone. The damage sat too deep. Too many stress fractures, too much deep-seated damage, and too much hurt as well to the ship's machine spirit. Sir Armaduke would never return to full combat-capable status ever again. And so, as it was easily expendable, it was the perfect choice for this particular mission. She was not really expected to be able to stand up to much that she might face in the void, but she would be an excellent transport, and if nothing else, her significant outward appearance, at least, might scare off the occasional small-scale Chaos Raider. Now, the group escorting the Sir Armaduke ran into significantly more than that, and there was some drama on the way, but to concern ourselves more directly with the operation at hand, the secret weapons laboratory was assumed to be too heavily guarded for any single force to take over. Even if enough ships could be sent without compromising security, it would likely be a long-term operation, weeks or possibly even months, before a facility of that size could be taken. Therefore, instead, the Tarnith had planned out a different approach. A combined stealth infiltration and loud and shouty boom boom bang bang distraction, where the Space Marines accompanying the Tarnith would head in through the front door, mainline hangars supported by Tarnith infantry. They would draw all the attention they conceivably could to themselves by burning, blasting, exploding, crushing, and killing anything and everything in front of them, whilst the Tarnith would provide rearguard support and hopefully a means of extraction later on. The distraction would be led by Major Gol Collier, whereas Ibrahim Gaunt would lead the main effort. This would be a stealth infiltration, where Sir Armaduke would nuzzle up against the armored hull of the enemy station and use Hades' breaching drills to dig their way through the outer shell. This was likely to be meters and meters thick, and a significant undertaking in its own right, but it was extraordinarily unlikely that the enemy would be able, willing, or even bothered to monitor the entirety of the vast complex's outer areas. There would be huge sections that would simply have been abandoned, or at least that was the information that the Imperials had received from Mabon Etogaur. And considering that yet further attempts on his life had been carried out even after the one on Balhut, it seemed as if his information was probably pretty on point. There had even been attempts on his life in transit to the enemy's research station, so he clearly knew something important. These areas, however, were likely to be guarded by something else. Either automated sentries or simply just absolutely ridiculous assloads of traps. Now honestly, even this feels like major high-level paranoia, as there were kilometers of traps inside of this damn thing, including entire hallways filled with massive explosives. It seems to me that this would be a rather silly thing, honestly. I mean, imagine if one of the countless stray giant rocks surrounding the station on all sides in Salvation Reach got pushed out of orbit, or simply emerged from the other side of the damn space area and hammered in to the research station. Okay, what are they gonna do if this happens to be in an area that is booby-trapped to shit and beyond, most of which were mechanical booby-traps, by the by, so they couldn't simply just, call in a code and disable them. The only way to get maintenance crews to the affected areas would be for the Chaos Forces themselves to go through and disable kilometers of their own traps to carry out emergency repairs, or simply just abandon the entire sector, I suppose. Seems a bit overdone, in my opinion, but it did prove at least partially successful, as despite the Tarnith First and Only's extensive preparations and expertise, they did set off at least one of these major traps before breaking into the deeper interior recesses of the station. Also, this is a personal inquisitorial gripe, but there is one trap that is a anti-tank trap that is set off by a human. Now, I don't know if you have a deep understanding of anti-tank mines, but very rarely are they manufactured to be so sensitive as to allow a human to set them off, because that would somewhat defeat the entire point of being an anti-tank mine. But hey, details. Oh, and there's a scene in this where Ludd, my favorite character, yells at Space Marines, which I tremendously enjoyed. Oh, and okay. I kind of wish that Gaunt's Ghost had ended on this book, and we'll get to that a bit later again, the reason for it, but another one of my favorite characters, to break my inquisitorial persona here for a moment, is Mert. Now, Mert is an individual who had everything. He was a scout sniper with Tarnith First and Only. The best of the best. He was handsome, cocky, and confident. His life was as good as his life could ever get, and then half of his face was blown off. Now that's a bad day in and of itself, but worse still was the fact that he was then fitted with an extremely crude augmetic replacement. That alone wouldn't be so bad. Sure, he was never going to be quite so handsome again, but The augmetic replacement was of such low quality that it messed up his speech, causing him constantly to gnaw out his word and stutter. This too wouldn't be that big of a deal if it weren't for the fact that this was caused by a constant electrical misfiring within the jaw. This meant that every time he tried to fire a rifle, this guy having once been one of the best marksmen in the entirety of the Tarnith First and Only, his jaw would tighten up, misfire, and jerk his shoulder and face around, screwing up his aim. That story is a long and sad one throughout the entirety of the book series. And him here now finally receiving a glorious send-off, covering the backs of the Tarnith as they withdraw with their loot. It was exactly the kind of thing the character needed. Anyways, we're wandering off the topic again. The Tarnith did indeed manage to break into the deeper, darker depths of the experimental weapons facilities, where they laid out yet more evidence that apparently this has been a blood-packed action. They left behind countless pieces of gear, scrap, and other indicators, as well as stealing a lot of very, very important things. War-endingly important things. Now, the Tarnith didn't quite know it at the time. They were mostly grabbing or destroying anything and everything they could, hoping that some of it would be valuable. But Mabon had also guided them towards some more remarkable objects. These were the real final nail in the coffin, the real culmination of the entire mission to drive a wedge in between the Gaur and Sek. And as the Tarnith began withdrawing themselves from the weapons research station and getting as many of their men out as they could, in the face of enormous enemy pursuit, as the entire station was now well and truly aware of what was going on and were rushing towards the Tarnith in overwhelmingly massive numbers, they blew the connections to the research station and got the hell out of there as quickly as the Armaduke's engines could push them. The Tarnith's casualties had been severe, but the fallout of the operation was far more enormous. Now, unfortunately, the conquering heroes never returned to the Imperial Crusade. Well, somewhat, anyways. And as the Sir Armaduke was assumed to have been lost with all hands, the Tarnith were posthumously awarded medals, honors, and Gaunt himself was given the rank of Lord Militant, having presumably been destroyed during the exit from the station, picked off by some enemy patrol or warship, or simply by warp malfunction. Now, we'll get back to that again on another time, as our timeline is getting awfully screwed up right now, but the purpose of the infiltration efforts and the raids was to get the Anarch and the Gaur fighting, and that succeeded. The exact extent of the disagreement that broke out between the two is very difficult to fully and accurately estimate, as obviously it was combat between two Chaos forces, far outside of any prying eyes. However, there were several indicators that mass combat had indeed broken out between the two. Entire planets were found with signs of vast military clashes, with no Imperial forces ever having been present. The debris of titanic real space void battles were also found, and signals traffics from within Chaos-held space became disjointed, and whatever communication had been going on between the two parties, already strained no doubt, had seemingly almost completely broken down by this point. In all due likelihood, Anaquinar Sek, who unquestionably believed himself to be the superior candidate for command over the entirety of the Chaos host, had long been chafing at being the Gaur's simple general, his dog on a leash. And to be fair, Sek was the superior commander. He had the greater tactical acumen, a far superior grasp of strategic planning. He was a brilliant man by comparison, no doubt about it, and would almost certainly have done far better than the Gaur. However, Sek had feared the Blood Pact, and had recognized the fact that if he had turned on the Gaur initially, the entirety of the Chaos cause in the Sabbat worlds would have crumbled, as Anaquinar's increasingly superior numbers would not have been enough to secure a rapid victory over the Gaur's fanatically loyal elites, thus exhausting both of their resources in the face of ever-increasingly determined Imperial offensives. But as much as Sek knew this on an intellectual level, it is very difficult indeed to subordinate yourself to someone you view, quite reasonably so, to be your own inferior. And now it seemed as if the Gaur had made the first move, as if he had started the war, and Sek therefore had to defend himself. He was under attack. His position within the Chaos forces was now being questioned. Even if he realized that this was somehow an Imperial setup, so long as everybody else under his command didn't believe that, he had to respond, or he would look weak. And the moment Sek started lashing out, the Gaur, who was a significantly less subtle individual, would of course respond in kind or greater, forcing Sek to respond again, which would cause the Gaur to respond, and so on, until a full-scale war was raging between the two Chaos warlords, and Macaroth's Imperial Crusade could finally get itself unstuck once more. It had been a risky operation, and a costly one, but it had been successful. Now it was up to Macaroth to make the most of the opportunity he had been given. As for Gaunt and the rest of them, well, we will be getting back to them too soon. But that will have to wait until the next episode. Till then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.